Hey guys, today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the RX 9060 XT 16GB at 1440p. Now, we already took a look at this card at 1080p and it performed exceptionally well. However, any modern graphics cards, even 8GB GPUs, typically can perform super well in 1080p. That's really just the case for pretty much any GPU released today. Now, moving up to 1440p, that is not always the case. We're going to be using the XFX Swift OC version of the card. And again, it's the 16GB model. At the time of my purchase, it was an MSRP model. We're playing on the latest AMD technical preview drivers that just offers a little bit more FSR4 support. And we're pairing with a 9800X3D as well as 64GB of DDR5. And quick note on the 9800X3D, the only reason that I'm going for the 9800X3D is because this is a GPU test. So I want to give the GPU the best chance of performing well. However, I do acknowledge and recognize that most people with a $350 GPU probably do not have close to a $500 CPU. So just keep in mind that depending on your CPU, your particular results might vary slightly. Most of our tests will be GPU bound anyways, but in some instances you could see maybe about a 5% performance decrease depending on the particular CPU that you are using. Let's hop in. All right, first up here we have Assassin's Creed Shadows. Playing at 1440p, of course, using borderless window because there is no exclusive full screen option. We are using FSR4 here set to quality. And we're on the high preset with diffuse everywhere set to on, which does give you a really nice ray trace global illumination type effect, as well as medium settings for our ray trace quality and our BVH quality. And here is where you can see FSR4 is enabled. And at 1440p with FSR4 set to quality, it looks essentially native. I mean, it's a really crisp looking image here. A game like Assassin's Creed, really, in my opinion, what you're looking for is 60 FPS at a consistent clip. And we are certainly getting that here so far, sitting right around 77 on our FPS average. Definitely a very strong experience so far. This game does not have like super fast-paced action combat that would necessarily dip our FPS to a super meaningful degree. You know, even in a more intensive type scene, you know, more crowded environment with a lot of NPCs in a city like this. Still getting well above 60 FPS, super strong looking image here, really great visuals with all that ray tracing turned on, even though it's not completely maxed out. The important settings are there, and without any sort of frame generation, we are already, as is, getting a real solid experience, using about 8.5 GB of video memory. So when you compare this to a 9060 XT that does not have 16 GB like the 8GB model, could potentially be met with a bottleneck as far as our video memory goes, but here, you know, we have plenty of space to implement frame generation, which does use more video memory. We really don't have to worry about video memory in this title at 1440p. It looks like whatsoever. So incredibly strong experience here. Really wouldn't be upset about, you know, having this type of performance really at all. And of course, you know, like I said, the combat is not really like the most intensive thing anyways, but entering into a bit of combat here does not affect our FPS to any sort of meaningful degree. And next up here we have Counter-Strike 2, not a super demanding game, but popular game nonetheless here, 1440p at full screen. And we're going to go for the high settings, which puts on 4 times MSAA. Now, you know, many people would probably play this game low settings just to make sure, you know, they're getting the highest possible FPS. In that particular scenario, we would likely be CPU bound, so I'm putting on high settings just to try to get a feel for the actual GPU performance in a title like this. And as you can see, you know, a game like Counter-Strike 2, it's not a demanding game really whatsoever. You know, you don't need even a card as powerful as a 9060 XT to run this game. You can run this game on, you know, integrated graphics. You can run this game on, you know, much older GPUs as well. In my opinion, incredibly responsive feeling title. I will say Counter-Strike 2 does seem, from my testing, to perform better on AMD cards compared to, you know, Intel cards, especially Intel cards, in my opinion and my experience, have had, like, I don't know, something about them, they just stutter a ton. And NVIDIA, they stutter a bit. It's not quite as smooth, but it's not as bad as Intel. But really, nothing quite beats the smoothness of AMD in Counter-Strike 2, in my personal opinion. But, you know, take that for a grain of salt, or with a grain of salt, rather. I am not someone who plays Counter-Strike a lot. This is not one of my, you know, super like games that I'm playing all the time, but my opinion, you know, getting a 225 FPS average, certainly a very, very strong experience here. And we are not in a situation where we are CPU bound. So the 9800X3D, which, you know, I didn't want it to be the bottleneck in any of our testing, and it doesn't seem to be here either. It seems to still be a GPU bound scenario, sitting right around 225. Really, really strong experience here. All right, next up here we have Cyberpunk 2077. And we're actually going to go for the Ray Tracing Ultra preset here, which puts us on FSR 2.1, which actually looks better than the other FSR 3 option. And we're going to manually come in here and just bump it down to balance. This is just about where it is anyways if we leave this at auto. And the only thing I'm going to adjust is just turning off motion blur. And once again, we are at 1440p here. And you can see, you know, the game looks solid. Like I said, FSR 2.1, I don't know exactly what it is about this game, but definitely, my opinion, I've had better looking visuals with FSR 2.1 as opposed to FSR 3. Unfortunately, no FSR 4 support out of the box. You can, you know, given that it's a single player game, you can go in and manually inject it with something like Optiscaler, but honestly, it looks pretty solid here. It doesn't look quite as sharp as native. There is some, like if you really do pixel peeping, there are some kind of weird visual effects, but as you can see, you know, we are getting just about 60 FPS, dipping below at times driving around. When you drive around the city like this is the most intensive thing that you can actually do in Cyberpunk. Like if we were to get off our bike and kind of just walk around, you can see our FPS is much more comfortably above that 60 FPS mark. But you know, you can see all the reflections on everything, the puddles on the ground, street lights. It looks great. You know, you're able to get this nice ray tracing effect, which is something that, you know, a game like Cyberpunk is a pretty transformative looking image. You're just going to have to use a little bit of that upscaling, and this would be one that I would, you know, if you're jumping in, have never played Cyberpunk and want to get a fresh start, probably worth your time making sure that you're getting the best looking visuals by injecting something like FSR 4 with Optiscaler. But just even using the default settings, you know, at stock here, you can see like how amazing these kind of scenes look. And we are getting a really solid FPS here and a pretty good looking picture, I will say. Now, I did also want to test without the ray tracing what we could kind of expect here. So let's put on Ultra. And actually for this, I'm just going to turn off resolution scaling completely. And once again, the only thing I'm going to adjust here is just turning off motion blur. So these are ultra settings at native resolution. I believe the game uses a built-in TAA for the anti-aliasing, but otherwise completely native looking picture here. So definitely if you are okay with, you know, not using any sort of ray tracing, you can pretty much get the same performance at native resolution. Now, in my opinion, the FSR, in my opinion, works pretty well in this game anyways. But, you know, at the same time, the ray tracing, it's not like it is make or break for this game. I still think the game has really good baked-in lighting solutions without the need for the real-time ray tracing anyways, so I really wouldn't blame someone for just wanting a more native-looking image, but you're getting around the same performance. So 60 FPS at Ultra or 60 FPS at Ray Tracing Ultra with that upscaling. So you can see, you know, you come to a setting like this, you know, getting right around 80 FPS standing still here. Ground still looks great. You know, we're still getting really cool looking visuals, you know, as far as like the reflections. They're just not ray traced, so it's not quite as dramatic. But, you know, our video memory is at around 10 gigabytes here without ray tracing. So another reason, you know, we're certainly happy to have a GPU that offers us more than those 8 gigabytes, which is definitely nice to have in a $350 GPU. You know, me personally, I'd probably honestly play at Ultra with even a bit of upscaling to get maybe even more consistent, like 90 or so FPS, or go for that Optiscaler method. But really, Cyberpunk, it's a great looking game. I don't think you need ray tracing to play this game. You know, maybe it's an unpopular opinion, maybe not, but, you know, I think the game looks really solid even without ray tracing. So if you've never played through Cyberpunk, you have a 9060 XT, you can definitely jump in here, play really in a lot of different ways and have a ton of fun here, and really great experience. All right, next up here we have Doom The Dark Ages playing at full screen 1440p at the Ultra Nightmare setting. We're playing at native resolution here using TAA. We're completely maxed out. The only thing we don't have turned on is path tracing. Now, this is a title that I do think, although it's single player, I like to play Doom at a, competitive like FPS, even though it's a single player game. It may sound kind of silly, but game feels way better when you're kind of flying around at 100 plus FPS. But at Ultra Nightmare, getting right around in the 70s in this area. We have a little kind of room up here that's a bit more intensive, probably going to be right around 60. I'm just looking to hopefully not drop below 60 FPS. As we kind of enter into our major room, we are seeing actually some dips below that 60 FPS mark. Our average, because we started off, in a less intensive area, is still holding above 60, but getting right around, in the mid 50s or so, sometimes jumping above 60. Our video memory is also sitting right around 12 gigabytes or so. So another instance where we certainly are happy that we have additional video memory, above that 8 gigabytes is definitely nice to have in this particular instance. That, definitely tells us that our bottleneck is actually the just the actual performance of the card, as opposed to just some kind of, another bottleneck like video memory that is just a bit more frustrating to run into. But definitely a solid experience here, not 60 FPS, but, solid enough that I'd be okay playing on these settings, just not quite optimal in my opinion. So even though I'm trying to only test, one setting per game, I am going to come down here and just bump us down to Ultra to see if this makes any sort of meaningful FPS difference. And even bumping down from Ultra Nightmare down to Ultra still seems like we're in a similar space, holding right around 60 FPS with some dips into the 50s. Now this game, unfortunately, it does not have FSR 4. However, it does have FSR. So let's just throw on FSR set to quality here and stick with our Ultra settings. And FSR quality, which I'm actually not 100% sure what version of FSR this uses, but regardless, this does still give us a really solid looking picture and put us well above that 60 FPS mark. So, another title that definitely might be a good option for manually injecting FSR 4 with something like Optiscaler, but even using, the default FSR model that we have here seems to be a pretty solid experience. And just for fun, let's go ahead and throw on our maxed out path tracing here. We'll stick with our Ultra settings with path tracing on, so this is not Ultra Nightmare necessarily, just Ultra, but with the nice path tracing. And let's set our FSR down to balance. I'm just kind of curious to see if this is even going to be a playable experience. Path tracing is incredibly demanding, so I'm not really expecting it to be great. And as we begin counting, you can see that, yeah, this does basically give us a pretty unplayable type experience at right around 30 FPS. Path tracing is really nice, on higher end GPUs. Definitely a nice feature to have. But, for the minimal gain that you have as far as your visuals, definitely not worth dropping all the way down to 30 in this particular instance. And next up here, I wanted to go ahead and show off Elden Ring Nightreign. Now, this is not the most demanding game, not by a long shot, actually. It's a relatively simple game to run here, but it's definitely a game that is still being, pretty popular here. And we're playing at max settings, 1440p. Now, this game is not the most interesting to benchmark unless we, apply our unlocked FPS mod, which I am not going to do today. But as you can see, there is a engine lock of 60 FPS. That is, of course, no problem to hit in this particular case. So while, not a super interesting game to benchmark because there is that engine locked of 60 FPS, there are a lot of games like this on PC that you'll find that kind of just run, regardless of the system that you have. So this is a popular game, had a ton of concurrent Steam users at launch and still is holding strong with a pretty solid player base. And, a card like this, 1440p, really no issue whatsoever. This game is well performing on a lot of different GPUs. As you can see, it's only pulling between like 40 and 80 watts on average here. Not even using 8 gigabytes of video memory. So, you'd be having a pretty solid time playing this game on a whole range of different GPUs. And the 9060 XT is no exception. It handles it just fine. Super solid experience here. All right, next up here we have Oblivion Remastered. Playing on 1440p on the high settings here. Ray tracing just set to software low using FSR 4 quality. Now this game, compared to when I originally benchmarked it, seems to be a lot better performing from my more recent tests. So you can see our frame time graph is actually pretty smooth, and the actual experience of playing the game feels a lot better. Now, it is an Unreal Engine 5 game, so there are just kind of those odd stutters, but it looks absolutely phenomenal here on high settings. I think in this game, high settings, regardless of the ray trace settings that you go with, is really the sweet spot. FSR is doing a great job at resolving all of our distant edges. View distance is really a non-issue. We're averaging out at around 70 FPS, which is a totally great place to be at. We are also starting from a more demanding area right outside of town and going into slightly less demanding type area here in the open world. You will also get, obviously, higher FPS in more interior spaces, caves, dungeons, inside shops, things like that. And with a lot of effects, a lot of combat going on, you might get a slightly lower FPS. But typically, what I found is the most demanding areas are kind of those areas right outside towns in the open world, but still rendering in a lot of assets. So while we are still getting some spikes here and there, that's more of an engine issue. Our video memory, even with the upscaling applied, is sitting at around 10 gigabytes. So certainly happy to have, our 16 gigabytes that we have available to us. But the game looks absolutely gorgeous and the card is handling it totally fine. Really, a game like this, there's definitely diminishing returns as far as your experience goes when you're talking about getting, 60 plus FPS compared to like 90, 100 FPS. In my opinion, it's not really going to be a meaningful difference. Really, the types of issues that are going to be bothering you are much more those stutters, which are pretty much just unavoidable. But as you can see, the stutters are not severe enough to really tank our 1% lows. They're still happening, like you'll see them pop up here and there on our frame time graph, but they're really not wrecking our experience really whatsoever. And definitely nice to have FSR4 without the need to go in like manually inject it with something like Optiscaler. So definitely a really, really strong performer here. And, even without the ray tracing or the ray tracing set to low, you're still getting pretty nice looking reflections in water and things like that. And it has the added benefit of when we go into water, it still looks pretty decent, but it doesn't like completely wreck our FPS when we're kind of interacting with these more demanding ray trace type surfaces. Still looks really solid in my opinion. Ray tracing on higher end cards, it is certainly nice to have and does look good in a lot of games, but oftentimes it's, in my opinion, more trouble than it's worth. And that's certainly the case on this card, in my opinion, unless you are, willing to just kind of use a ton of that, ton of upscaling, which, can get you a pretty great result at times. But without the need for super aggressive upscaling, we're getting a pretty great result as is without even needed to really, oh my god, there's a ton of guys here, but that's without really even needing to mess with any of that stuff. So yeah, Oblivion Remastered, total pass here at 1440p, looks absolutely great. All right, next up here we have Fortnite. Now I did a extensive test on Fortnite that is either out already or will be out shortly. So definitely check that out when it comes out. But we're playing here 1440p using TSR set to quality. There's no FSR in this game. We're going for the high preset, which does use ray tracing, lumen on high for both global illumination as well as reflections. So these are definitely not, the competitive settings. You'd get the highest possible FPS, but probably, in my opinion, more settings that most people will go for. Just casual players just want a good looking experience. So dropping in here. Again, I've done extensive testing. Fortnite is a game that, different people play for different reasons. So, the reason I did that long form video, it took forever to make. So if you're interested in Fortnite, performance on this particular GPU, definitely check out that specific video. But, people come to Fortnite for different reasons. Some people come just casually, want to come in, have a good time, play, have good looking visuals. Other people, they just want to win. They just want to give them, themselves the best possible chance to win. So there's a lot of different reasons that people come in and play the game. There's a ton of different settings that may be relevant. So this is just one of them, the high preset. We're using TSR because, TSR does look really solid at higher resolutions, in my opinion. So, in my personal opinion, there's not really a good reason not to at least, if you're at 1440p or 4K, just use TSR, go to quality. If you have an NVIDIA GPU, use DLSS. But if you're on an AMD card, because they don't support FSR, you're kind of stuck with TSR. But honestly, as far as a baked-in solution for upscaling, TSR is actually pretty solid. So, running around here, you see we're getting right around 120 FPS on our average. Video memory is really no issue whatsoever in this particular title at this resolution. Even higher resolutions like 4K. They do use more than 8 gigabytes, but, it's hit or miss whether or not that really is a meaningful, is going to make a meaningful difference. But As you can see, we are getting what I would personally consider to be a pretty competitive type FPS, sitting right around 130 or so. Totally happy with this particular performance. Really can't ask for much more when it comes to Fortnite. Yeah, there are options that we can come in here, play on performance mode, get, 500 FPS, go in, set, and, an artificial lock to get a smoother experience, which I did test in my, Fortnite specific video. But as far as, just generally the card is going to be able to give you a really solid experience, give you options, which is important for Fortnite. You can play on a lot of different settings. Basically, just come in here, get whatever kind of performance that you're looking for, and, have a great time. So, yeah, definitely Fortnite. Not that it is a huge surprise, but certainly a pass on the 9060 XT. No question about it. All right, guys, next up here we have Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced Edition. And we're going to start off here on the maximum preset, but we are going to turn off ray tracing just for now. So this is just the maxed out settings. Using TAA as our anti-aliasing, this does now support FSR for upscaling, which is nice, but we're not going to use it. Just using TAA for anti-aliasing, everything else set to max. The only adjustment I made is just turning off motion blur. And as you can see, this does put us into very high FPS range. However, in Grand Theft Auto 5, and as you can see, our GPU is actually not even fully utilized, but in Grand Theft Auto 5, when you get into like the 140, 150, 160 territory, you do start running into some issues, both with frame pacing typically, and then also just with the actual way that the game kind of operates. So if you want to play without ray tracing, you're better off setting some sort of FPS limit, maybe around 120 frames per second or something like that, to get a bit more smooth of an experience. As you can see, our 1% low down at 62. While this doesn't feel bad necessarily, there are times, like if you look at our frame time graph, there are kind of just these little stutters that, you're playing the game, you may not actually like feel them if you're not super adept at kind of feeling those frame pacing issues, but it just kind of results in a bit of a not super smooth experience. So limiting to 120 essentially gets you the same performance. I mean, in my opinion, 120 to 150, you're not really, the difference is very, very minimal as far as what you're actually feeling. And you're going to be getting a much, much smoother experience. And just to kind of articulate that, this is those same settings, but with that 120 FPS limit in place. So now we're getting locked solid 120 with a completely flat frame time graph. Even if we kind of like pan our camera around, we're driving a fast car, some effects going on, it's not dropping whatsoever. So if you're playing and you're kind of achieving that 150, 160 range, you're better off capping your frame rate at around 120. Maybe you might be able to get away with 130 or so, something like that. But this is a much, much, much more pleasant experience. But this is without ray tracing. So let's go ahead and toggle on our ray tracing. So all we're going to do is just come in, set our maximum RT, which sets all of our ray tracing aside from second ray. Trace global illumination bounce. I actually didn't know this was an option in game here. We'll set that to off. This is just the default maximum RT preset. So this does now bring us down into right around 60 FPS. I mean, for a game like Grand Theft Auto 5, if you're playing single player especially, 60 FPS, is a totally acceptable level of performance in my opinion. You do also have the option for FSR. You could just use that quality FSR. You can see we are getting, these nice like real-time reflections, as well as like the global illumination and how it kind of handles like shadows and things like that, and how the light fills. That is really, in my opinion, like the biggest difference. Reflections, there are a lot of reflections in this game, and they pop up more than you would really think. Like pretty much every car kind of has like reflections. If you look, like all the paint is pretty glossy, and you can look at those reflections and see them. It's not really like making a meaningful difference as far as like your experience playing the game necessarily. You're going to be playing the same game regardless. So, for my money, I would rather play without the ray tracing on to get that native picture. But if you wanted to, you could certainly come here, get around 60 FPS on our average. Some dips below. We'll go into kind of this hilly area up here that has a bit of foliage. This is typically the most demanding part of Grand Theft Auto 5. But as you can see, even with ray tracing on, native resolution, our video memory, again, while it's nice to have 16 gigabytes and, I don't want to make it seem like it's not a big deal that we do have 16 gigabytes. It certainly is a good thing, and, we're certainly happy to have it. But as you can see, it's not really making a meaningful difference. We seem to have a bottleneck that is in place. aside from just that video memory. So, in more demanding scenes like this, you will be dipping below 60. So, we'll take a look actually. Again, don't really want to do a super in-depth benchmark on each game, but just because we're not hitting that 60 FPS mark at maxed out ray tracing, let's just go in and apply that FSR quality. So FSR is down here under our frame scaling options. It has, just default basic TAA upscaling for our frame sampling. We also have FSR1 as well as FSR3. No support for FSR4 as far as I know out of the box. Although it does look like you can actually come in and apply it here. So actually I'm going to restart the game and make sure our FSR4 is applied, and then we'll hop back in. All right, so now with FSR4 applied here at the quality preset, same settings here that we're testing. So these are the max ray trace settings, and this does now seem to get us pretty solidly and consistently above 60 FPS. While pretty much, great thing about having this machine learning FSR4 is that at quality settings, it essentially looks native, gives you really clear, concise, good-looking anti-aliasing, while giving you essentially a native-looking picture. Oftentimes it even looks better than TAA, and then also has the added benefit of giving you a, about 10 to 15% improvement in your performance. So really great results here. Really happy to see that FSR4 is supported in this title. I wish the FSR4 was just supported out of the box by default, having to go into Adrenaline to enable it. It's just annoying in my opinion. I don't really see why that's the case. Now, probably won't be the case, forever. I imagine the games will be just released with just stock FSR4 support enabled. Hoping that's the case, although I'm imagining that they're partially doing FSR3 and continuing to support that due to the fact that it's supported across every platform as well as older AMD cards. But regardless, just a little bit of work enabling it, and you are able to get a consistent 60 plus FPS experience here with those nice ray trace real-time reflections and really great picture image here. All right, next up here we have Marvel Rivals. We're playing at 1440p borderless windowed here. That's just because full screen is giving me a bit of issues. I don't know what it is about this game. It doesn't like to be captured in full screen for whatever reason without messing with the resolution. We're going to use FSR4 here set to quality, which, the reason we're doing quality FSR is just because, it can improve latency times. FSR4 looks great, especially at quality on these higher resolutions like 1440p. I'm going to go with the high settings here. Now, this is a game that, some people might think, oh, just go for low settings. And the game does look pretty good on low settings to get the, highest possible FPS. Honestly, it would be a game that might benefit from having a real in-depth type video. So I may consider doing that for a 9060 XT if there's enough demand for it. But we're just starting off here, high settings, which does use ray tracing with our Lumen global illumination, though. Like I said, it's not really transformative, but it is there, so it's slightly demanding. And so yeah, 1440p high settings with FSR set to quality. All right, so starting off here on high settings, and as you can see, we are just right away getting a pretty solid performance around 100 FPS. My opinion, game like this, I'd like to be getting right around 120. So getting around like 106, totally fine. I mean, you can certainly use a bit more of that upscaling to get there even further, and also have the option of definitely bumping down some settings. Even just coming off high would give you a pretty meaningful improvement. Anytime I benchmark a game like this, I seem to get a lot of comments, and they say things like, oh, well, why would you use FSR quality? Just use FSR performance. You'll get better performance, which is true. However, in my opinion, a game like this, you still want a good-looking game, a good-looking picture. Most of the time, in my opinion, I would rather go for lower settings at a less aggressive upscaling option to get the higher FPS. But, maybe that's just me. Even the really good-looking upscaling, I try to, use them sparingly just because, a native picture, a native looking picture, in my opinion, looks far, far better than, just artificially, getting that FPS with a upscaled image. But again, that's why, going through a more in-depth test here might be a smart idea. But as you can see, 1440p, really no issue whatsoever here. We are using slightly more than 8 gigabytes of video memory, so another instance where could potentially be seeing a bottleneck if we didn't have 16 gigabytes here. But, in general, definitely a real solid place to be here. I just, we did drop a bit below 100. Now we're averaging in 96, but still, my opinion, totally acceptable here. Solid performance. And the inclusion of FSR4 definitely gives you a lot of room to kind of basically get whatever performance you want, so long as you are okay with just introducing that upscaling, which FSR 4, you know, even though I don't like using upscaling a ton, FSR 4 definitely, you know, lessens the blow a little bit, definitely makes it a much nicer experience. Even with, like, you know, an ultimate going off here, you can see we do drop at times, like, into the high 80s, but really holding a pretty solid experience here, right around 95 on our average. You know, as far as like an Unreal Engine 5 game goes, Marvel Rivals has pretty consistent frame times, as you can see by our frame time graph. But yeah, definitely a solid experience here at 1440p. Really no complaints whatsoever. All right, next up we have Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Playing at 1440p here, and we are using FSR 4 set to quality on the very high preset with high for our ray tracing preset. So pretty high settings here. And this is also definitely a game that seems to really like video memory, so we'll see how this looks. Also, despite the fact that this game is a single player game, it certainly is one of those games that I would really like to be getting higher than 60 FPS in, because there's so much fast action. You know, the web swinging really feels really great when you're at a higher FPS. So being at right around 90 here definitely feels pretty solid. FSR 4 quality looks incredible. Really looks pretty, you know, close to native. You can't really tell much of a difference between this and native in my personal opinion. No major, you know, visual artifacting or weird effects or ghosting or anything like that that I can tell, even with this really fast action here. And we are getting those ray trace reflections, you know, come up to a window, things like that. You can see ourselves. But really, you know, where you see the most difference when you are talking about ray tracing is when you're kind of on the ground, like puddles, things like that. It's funny, of course, Spider-Man game that notoriously had like a lot of drama surrounding puddles in one of their earlier tech demos. But as you can see, the game looks incredible. We're getting pretty solid FPS, good 1% lows. This is one of those games that is pretty CPU dependent. So this particular pairing, you know, when you compare it to, if you were to compare 9060 XT with a lesser quality CPU, you might be getting worse performance. But as you can see, like I said, this game, for whatever reason, it's super aggressive with its amount of VRAM that it uses. It doesn't actually seem to bottleneck too hard when you have less VRAM. For whatever, I don't know, the VRAM usage is weird, but as you can see, we are using, or at least allocating, or somehow setting aside 15.5 gigabytes nearly of video memory, which is pretty crazy. So it's basically sucking up all of the video memory that we have on our card and setting it aside. Now, it's not resulting in any sort of bottleneck. As you can see, our frame time graph is pretty much as smooth as you're going to get in this particular game. I mean, the game does have some slight stutters and things like that. We actually haven't hit one yet, surprisingly, but really solid performance here. Pretty much, you know, as good as you can ask for as far as the stutters and things like that. You know, getting around 80 to 90 feels absolutely incredible. This game does actually swing. Again, I always say that in this game, but no pun intended, but the FPS does pretty dramatically change when you pan your camera in certain areas. So looking at the sky, it'll shoot us up, looking down at the ground, and kind of more at the horizon where there's actually more going on. You'll see more representative experience, you know, but swinging around like this is really the most intensive scene that you're going to do. But it is important, definitely, for this game that when you are kind of swinging around, that it does feel fluid, it does feel smooth, that you're at least above 60 FPS, and ideally you'd want to be even higher. So, you know, we have FSR 4, so you could certainly bump it down to balance upscaling, still get a pretty good looking picture. But even here at quality, you know, the game looks great, it's performing really well, and definitely a really solid experience here. So let's come down into one of these like dynamic world events and see how it performs here. And while it does dip a bit, actually did dip below 60 for a moment there with some of these effects going on. Not super severe, honestly. Didn't really notice anything super, you know, catastrophic as far as our performance. Really solid performer here. And while the video memory, this particular title probably needs a deeper dive to figure out why exactly it uses so much. And really, in my experience, even when I have an 8GB card, it doesn't really seem to be like a unplayable experience, which the amount of video memory that we're using here would indicate that it probably would be. So that's kind of something that's a bit interesting. So anyways, game looks great, is performing well, and definitely a solid pass at 1440p. Even without the upscaling, you know, you could likely turn ray tracing off and get similar, if not better, you know, performance at native. So definitely a really good experience here. All right, next up here we have Monster Hunter Wilds. Definitely a VRAM intensive and really just a generally intensive game. And we're playing at 1440p here, of course. using the Ultra Graphics preset, which uses both FSR, and we did go ahead and enable the FSR 4 toggle within Adrenaline software, so it's definitely nice that we have that. Frame generation is off, upscaling is just set to quality here, and we are using the highest resolution texture quality, which is certainly something that we would only be able to do with that 16 gigabytes of video memory. You can see, although our video memory estimated usage is only 7.59, you will see in practice it's going to be much more than that. All right, so starting off here just in our little town here, this is typically where performance is actually pretty demanding. So starting off here, getting right around 60 or so, slightly lower, is certainly actually pretty promising for the general performance of this game. But let's hop out into the open world here and see how this holds true as we kind of get into some combat. And you'll definitely see what I mean by the video memory. The 7 gigabytes, we're nearly doubling that. And if we had anything less than 16 gigabytes, really, we'd be encountering some pretty major issues here. However, even with our just pretty much default preset here, while we're hovering pretty close to 60 to the point where it feels decent, we are still dropping below 60 pretty consistently here. So, you know, this is a very demanding title. It's more demanding than really it has any right to be, in my personal opinion, but you know, getting around 59 on our average here doesn't feel the best, if I'm being completely honest. Now, luckily with FSR 4, we can bump this down even more down to balanced and still retain a pretty much, you know, exactly the same type picture experience, and this should bring us just slightly up a bit and see if this holds more consistently above that 60 FPS. Already kind of dipping below 60, to be honest, right around, and the 50 is kind of similar experience, honestly. Here, not super thrilled with this performance. Now, this is not a competitive like multiplayer game that would, you know, absolutely be unplayable at lower FPSs, but you know, hovering right around 60 feels okay here. Honestly, if you were to turn off your frame counter, or if I were to drop my frame counter here and you were to tell me, oh, this is a locked 60 FPS, I would probably believe you. You know, our 1% lows are still relatively respectable, dropping right down to 42. But as you can see, you know, if we just kind of watch our FPS, we are pretty much getting, you know, essentially, you know, perfect performance here. Nothing really super major in terms of any sort of issues here, but I'd like to be getting a bit higher, if I'm being completely honest. While this is not a competitive game, it is a multiplayer game, and a game that does require some timings when it comes to, you know, your parries, your guards, your things like that. So getting a consistent frame rate is certainly important, even if we're not getting a 60 FPS experience, and we are getting a relatively, you know, consistent experience. The extra video memory is definitely leading to our frame time graph staying pretty solid here. No major issues where, you know, it's all of a sudden dropping us to like the 30 FPS territory or anything like that. So that's certainly nice to see. But this is just a demanding game. You know, it's not a well-optimized game. It's built on this RE engine that is really not great when it comes to, you know, open world games. And I wish that they chose a different engine for this particular title. Even something like Unreal would have been definitely, you know, an improvement when it comes to the FPS as well as the visuals. I mean, the visuals, it's a good looking game, especially when you do bump up the textures. But in general, you know, it's just, I don't know, this game, I've mixed feelings about it. I think it's a really fun game, and it, you know, was a popular game at the time of release. It's kind of obviously fallen off in terms of popularity slightly, but, you know, still, I wish it was more performant. It seems like it could be, and I was, at the time of release, definitely hopeful that it would, you know, be a bit more, like receive some updates and things like that to make it a bit more performant, but it honestly really hasn't improved as much as I would have liked to see it improve. But in general, you know, with balanced upscaling here, we are averaging 60 FPS and getting a relatively smooth frame time graph, so really can't complain too much. Definitely the other reason why I would like to be getting a higher FPS is because there are definitely scenes in this game that will be more demanding than just, you know, a simple fight like this. So in those instances, we would probably drop even further below, like into the 40s and things like that. So, you know, it's part of the reason why I'm not super thrilled with the performance, is just, you know, looking forward and knowing that, you know, it's only going to get really worse from here in most instances. Anyways, guys, that's been it for the 9060 XT 16GB at 1440p. Definitely a well-performing card, and for $350, in my opinion, if you had $350 to spend on a GPU, I don't even think twice. This is the pick. Now, if you're talking about comparing it against cards in its price range, you're really thinking about like a 5060 Ti 8GB that can be found for around its price. 5060 Ti 16GB is going to be a pretty substantial, like 70 at the minimum, you know, $70 increase. But at 350, it's really hitting a sweet spot. You're really not going to be left wanting for much more. And the fact that it does have FSR4 support, and the support for FSR4 within games is only going to get better here going forward. Really can't go wrong. Super happy with the card. Now here's to hoping that it can actually be found at MSRP for a good while. All right, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.